So my mahi is to give a bit of an overview of how we came to do this work and where we're at the moment. And one of the things I do want to say is that this is just one tiny contribution to the wider mātauranga around Kare-ā-roto, and as we do more interviews we realise how little we know around, or how little we've been able to revitalise more generally around this whole whakaaro around Kare-ā-roto. So I just wanted to put that out there. We're about halfway through the mahi, and so we're just going to share some of the things that we've come to see and that people have shared with us on the journey. And then we're hoping that later this year or early next year we'll be able to have more of a national sharing symposium to share. And so we'll let you know around that. But Ngā Kare-ā-roto, the Ripples Within, is a project that is hosted by Tūtama Wahine o Taranaki. Tūtama Wahine o Taranaki is a Māori social justice organisation working primarily in family violence prevention and intervention, but going across a whole lot of other areas of... So Ngā Ropi Raumati, who was one of the founding members with Auntie Marge Raumati and Huirangi Waikere when they formed about 35 or 36 years ago, talks about Tūtama Wahine as being a social justice and liberation organisation. So the kaupapa is not just about healing, but it's about long-term aspirations for mana motuhake. And in many ways, what they talk about as an organisation is that they look forward to the day when they're not required. So they're trying to do themselves out of mahi. In a different way to what the Crown is trying to do us out of mahi at the moment. So this is the team working on this mahi. There's myself, Rangi, Jenny Lee Morgan, Hineti Moana, Papahuia, and more recently Naomi has joined the Kairangahau team. And the advisors are Ngā Ropi Raumati and Linda Tuhiwai Smith, as I said, hosted by Tūtama Wahine o Taranaki, which is based in Waitara, and funded by the Marsden Fund. So how we came about doing this mahi was really informed by earlier work that we'd done. So as a research group, Kaupapa Māori research group, the mahi we do is always alongside practitioners, pretty much. I think that is one of the critical ways in which Kaupapa Māori as an approach really plays itself out, is that we're not there for research's sake, right, which is often what happens in the research space, but we're actually engaged with our people who are on the ground, who are doing the work, who are practitioners, who are living on the land, as you've seen in all of Rangi's mahi that he does. Actually active, we don't just talk about the land, we live with the land, we live on the land. We don't just talk about social change, but we actually are engaged in social change with our whānau hapu iwi, our communities. So in earlier research that we did alongside Tūtama Wahine o Taranaki and led again by Ngā Ropi Linda Smith, Hiniwirangi Kohu, has been very instrumental from here, very instrumental in informing how we do our mahi, and has been involved in the last 3 projects that we have done in the area of family violence prevention and in trauma-informed healing and trauma-informed care. And so we always acknowledge her contribution and her connection to here and informing how we do what we do in this area. And one of the things in particularly in He Oranga Ngākau, which was the trauma-informed care space, where we looked at this question of what does this idea of trauma-informed care, and as providers you'll know that model has been imported primarily from London, from America, from Australia, not from an Indigenous perspective, but from a very Western psychological perspective and framework. And one of the things that came up in some conversations with Ngāropi and Here Wirangi was, what does that mean for us, our Māori nei? If our providers and our social services have been told we have to take this approach, but what does that approach actually mean when it's coming out of a cultural framework that has nothing to do with us? It's very individual. It's not about collective knowledge. It's not about the historical ways in which we know that we carry trauma not only of our own current, present experiences, but of our tupuna. And how do we think about that in a healing space when that healing framework is primarily about, and I'm not saying it's not useful for individuals because we know that it is, right? So that's not about that, but that it was never enough. They were saying that's not enough for us. We need more than what is being promoted. So, but what we've seen in that mahi in the family violence space, research and practice and the trauma healing and practice is that there's probably two areas that are least talked about in terms of in-depth rangahau, but also that we have tended not to talk about very much, and that is wairua and Kare-ā-roto. Now, the wairua one, we understand, has been a process of us, I think, protecting that mātauranga. He āhua kurahuna, wetahi o tērā kōrero. But what came up in that work is that actually we're ready, and I think that's what we see in the work around maramataka, what we see around the puanga māmatariki, is that we are ready for it. We are ready as Māori, as whānau, as hapu and iwi, to be able to talk about that in a way where we're not having to worry about what others say about us. Because we've got a whole history of people really telling us we're crazy, right? I mean, there's a whole lot of mental health stuff, there's a whole lot in psychology that labelled wairua, that labelled tuhunga, right back to the Tuhunga Suppression Act, as being things that were not healthy, but we know that they are. And I think that what we've seen in this space is that many of our whānau have continued to do this mahi. I'm not saying we haven't done it, but we haven't necessarily talked publicly or talked openly with each other in many ways because we've had to protect much of that knowledge. In terms of Kare-ā-roto, what we know is that colonisation has had very dominant ways of thinking about emotions, about siloing the way in which we think about emotions, senses, feelings as all separate things from each other. But what we're already seeing in this mahi is actually they're all intersecting. And they are in Western frame, but they're very siloed in the way in which they think about things. They're often very cognitive, whereas we're often very puku. So we're just seeing a whole lot of things coming up in that research that made us think about, it's an area we should probably begin delving more into. And as I said at the beginning of this, we're just touching a tip of the iceberg. In my view, having read some of the kōrero that people have shared with us and understanding our whānau hapu iwi relationships, but that we have multiple tikanga, we have multiple kawa, that there's never going to be one explanation for any of this. There's always going to be many, many explanations, and in our view, they're all correct for your own whānau hapu iwi, or rohi, or waka, however we want to frame ourselves collectively. So one of the things that came up in the trauma-informed care, so we called it he oranga ngākau, and we were looking at the notions of oranga and the role of the ngākau in that space. And one of the things that came up from directly from Ngāropi, Raumati, in that mahi was, she said, Leonie, we have wahine particularly, who come in to this space and they've gone through a whole lot of experiences in terms of family violence, and they will say when they go back, but he loves me. And she said, I wonder if they would say that if they knew the true meaning of aroha, instead of what we've been told is love, which is often a very Valentine's Day, red roses, unconditional, doesn't matter what they do, kind of love. So that made us think we really need to delve into this, because if we can't understand that aroha, when we speak of aroha, me aro tō hā ki te hā o tētahi atu, as being a space of safety, then how do we ever move beyond this idea that he loves me no matter that he beats me or my children? And so what she really was saying to us is that we've got a very colonised view of emotions, and therefore what that means is that we end up having a very colonised view of relationships. Not just intimate relationships, but also familial relationships. All forms of relationships can be healthy or can be abusive. And so her thing was, we should look at aroha. And that's how we started thinking about looking at Kare-ā-roto. And looking at how we think about emotions and emotional well-being, emotional intelligence, in a way that enables us to reframe some of the ways in which things are happening for us individually and collectively. The other thing that came up was in a lot of the, and Naomi's going to talk specifically to whenua, but in a lot of the settlement processes, we found in Taranaki that the greatest abuser of our whānau was actually not ourselves, it was the Crown. And what that did was that made us have to really think about what is family violence. I'm not here to speak about family violence, but I just wanted to give a context. And so the way in which, in that process, Ngāropi, Auntie Marge and others started thinking and talking about family violence some years ago, was that family violence is the playing out of colonial violence in our homes. It's a reproduction of colonial violence in our homes. So one of the ways we have to think about intervening that is that we have to intervene, we have to decolonise, basically. So that just brings things into a whole different frame of thinking. That's driven by practitioners, driven by our people who are in healing spaces, driven by the ways in which we think about things. And Hene Wirangi would say to us all of the time, I sing because I'm singing myself into healing. If you want me to heal, then you have to open the door to my songs. And so, sorry pups, this keeps going down. If you want me to heal, you need to open the door for me to sing my songs. Because healing is about our own reclamation of those things. So that's kind of how, in terms of where we're at Tūtuma Wahine, how we came to decide this whakaaro around looking at, particularly at Māori expressions and understandings of emotions, but also that there was a strong advocacy with many of the providers and social justice workers that the organisation works with that was saying the same thing. This is not new. Many people have been saying this. Many people have been saying this. Many people have been looking into this. But what we realise is that there's very little research that's been undertaken. So as I said, it's been informed by different ways in which we've engaged in other research. So Jenny Lee Morgan, her area of focus often is pūrākau. And so she writes a lot around pūrākau as a process of reclaiming, regenerating, revitalising, re-knowing our own stories in our own way, told by ourselves. And so one of the things that she has talked about in this mahi is that how, and this is not new either, many of our people have said that our stories are being cleaned up. And so have our mōtiatia. Many of our mōtiatia have been cleaned up, particularly in translation. So intimacies have been removed out. Anything relative to sexuality has often been removed in translation. Anything related to intimate relationships has often been removed in translation. And so we get these stories told to us through other people's lenses that actually are very unemotive, which is very contradictory to the reo Māori versions of those. So she says that emotion through ethnography has been removed from many of the ways in which our stories have been told in English, and that we need to retell our stories with the depth of what actually was happening for our tupuna, in order to then see that reflected in ourselves again. So that's the work that she's looking at. Whakatauaki and Pakawai we're going to talk about a little bit later, Maramataka with Rangi's work. And then in the research we've done, Te Aki Nā Te Pāhara Keke, He Oranga Ngākau and He Waka Eke Noa, and all of those, it kept coming up. I don't know how to express myself, I go straight to anger, I don't know what to do. To get them under control, I have to do certain things. To get away from the control, I have to do certain things. You know, just the people wanting to know more about what is actually happening for us, what is happening in terms of on an emotional space, and that Indigenous approaches to historical and colonial trauma have been telling us for very long, and I think we've been very informed by a lot of the Indigenous approaches to historical trauma and how they impact on intergenerational trauma, because particularly Native American communities have been saying for a very long time that much of the trauma that is manifesting for us in our current days is actually an ancestral trauma that we have yet to resolve and heal. So they talk about it in relation to unresolved grief, that we have unresolved grief. Now it's not only human unresolved grief, we have unresolved grief in our whenua. And I remember Huirangi many years ago would say to us, you need to know where you're walking and what you're walking on. Because in all of these areas within Taranaki, all of these things happened that have never been cleared, they have never been resolved. The grief and the trauma in the whenua itself, and I think Naomi will speak to some of this. And so as descendants of our whenua, as descendants of Papatūānuku, as people who walk our whenua, the knowing of our history is more than just knowing the history. It's more than just saying we know about that place, but it's actually about understanding which areas we need to resolve the grief in and the trauma in before we walk it and carry it from that point. So they have very strong ideas within Native American particularly and Indigenous communities around resolving the ancestral grief. And I read a thing from Mary Yellowhorse Braveheart, and she talked about the Lakota process over a 5-day period of resolving ancestral grief, and it sounded to me like a tangi, but a tangi for their tupuna, who were never given a tangi. That's how I thought about it. It's not the terminology that they would use, but over a 5-day period, they would work to resolve the historical grief continue to be held by the current generations in order to work out ways of not handing it to our tamariki mokopuna. So all these things are all really important to how we are thinking about this kaupapa. And then we have, why is it important? And, there's a kind of general literature around it. There's very little Māori literature, and Rangi's going to talk about the term Kare-ā-roto anyway, and the source of that particular term. But what we do know when we look across cultural frameworks and cultural knowledges around emotions, that there is a really significant contribution of emotions, emotional well-being, whether we call it emotional intelligence, all those things that are being documented in terms of health, education, justice, and identity. So within the whakaaro tuakiri, tuakiri is not just identity, we know that. We know that it's not, identity is a tidy English word for it, but it's actually more than that, because inherent in the kupu, tua o te kiri, there's something much more than just an identity in tuakiri. And Taina Pohatu talks about the various sites in which we experience what tuakiri means for us, ngākau manawa. I'm not going to go into that at the moment, but that emotions are interconnected clearly with well-being, that emotions and emotional expression are tied in complex ways to family, culture and societal dynamics. So this is from kind of more progressive literature around emotions, okay? So that connects it to culture, connects it to collectives, connects it to social dynamics, that they're relational and they're contextual, and that they vary with culture. And that emotions also linked to both the experience and healing of intergenerational and historical trauma. So in many ways, so what we have to do in this country, and particularly at the moment, so we have to keep proving to them why it's important. So there is growing literature around why it's important that we can draw on. That's like a hōhaere for us, but it's not what defines us, but that we can walk alongside it. And we do this in our mahi all the time, right? We have frameworks that are not necessarily Māori nei, but that are useful because they walk along. We can walk alongside. They can be collaborators with us. They can be partners with us. We can utilise them. Hei hōhaere. And I don't think that's ever, that's not new. I think our tupuna always did that because we can see in how our tupuna utilise particular tools, utilise particular things. The thing is when those tools and those imported ideas override our own. That's when we become in a different context. So this is the pātai for this particular kaupapa. It's a beginning. It really is just a beginning, and you'll see that the way we're approaching it is in line with each of our collective and our individual areas of interest that we're working in. So for me, with Tūtama Wahine, the area of interest is in the healing space. They want to know about emotions and healing. Other people want to know about the role of maramataka, the role of how feelings or how energies operate. And there's mixed views on this. That's what I mean. There's not one single view on this. Others are interested in the relationship to whenua, how we name ourselves, how emotions are not only within the whenua, but we utilise Kare-ā-roto or frameworks or experiences to name our whenua, to name our whetū. To draw on the knowledge of those things. So we've really, and pūrākau in terms of thinking about those narrative forms that we, so what we've got is that we've framed this in line with the small team that we have to think about some initial whakaaro. But as I said, I think every single person, every single Māori organisation should be doing this for yourselves, aligned to your own mōtiatia, to your own whakatauki, to your own whenua ingoa. There's so much scope for us each to do this for ourselves. So we're just providing an example, I guess, of one way of doing it. So this came from Kiri Opai, who's tetahi o ngā mātanga reo ki Taranaki, around Kare-ā-roto. And as I said, Rangi's going to talk specifically to where the term came from, because it's a relatively new term, ngā Kare-ā-roto, but broadly translated as ripples within or waves within. And we know that when we feel that in our puku, it feels like that. There is that sense, that physicality of that. And when Kiri Opai was talking about this at one of the hui we had in Taranaki, he was talking about rongo a ngākau a wairua. And that it's like a gut reaction, a distinct āpuku reaction. We will send these PDF these PowerPoints out. Sorry, I should have said that at the beginning. Because the whole whakaaro is to try and share this material. And then one of the one of the whānau that we talked about, because we said to him, what do you think this means, Kare-ā-roto? What does this mean to you? And so one of them talked about kare, rippling. It can be either forced, so it's rushed, or it can be gentle rippling. So the response is quite different from the very big splashes and the rushes to the very gentle ripplings and those emotions. I thought this was really beautiful. Kōrero, emotions are the things that spirit intelligence use. They are our security alarm systems, our spiritual security alarm systems. And all through this mahi, people are talking about what it means for them as indicators, as tohu of something either happening in your space and the way in which it manifests itself. We had a series of kōrero a couple of years ago when we were first scoping this idea out at the University of Waikato. We had a small two-day symposium. And so we asked a number of people to come and share what Kare-ā-roto meant for them and we gave them each a particular emotion to think about. And so this is from Whaia Williams. So you can see here the hohunutanga that comes with thinking about emotions are Māori. And so with that depth of whakaaro, we really are touching the tip of the iceberg at the moment in terms of what we have access to, a hapu, a iwi nei. So e ngā aomua I te taho no karaua o ngā kuia e kore rātou I wehi I tēnei me te Kare-ā-roto mai I te āhua o te tangata. Kei reira no te te āhua ko ngā tairongo, he haere tahi era ngā tairongo me ngā Kare-ā-roto. And this is what I was just kind of alluding to around when we look at Western literature. There's an intersection, but they're very defined. Emotions, feelings, senses are defined very separately, often. And they're often related to the cognitive only, on the whole. Although there is more literature around the physicality, the physical senses of emotions. So ngā tairongo, in terms of the senses and the emotions sitting ka haere ngā tahi. Ko taku whakamarama pia ko tētahi I roto I ngā mahi a te matatini. So this is such a good example from Whaia, is those notions of, because we know, right, because we watch kapaka. Nā te whakau e, ai, tēnā koutou. That ihi. I mean, how do we describe those things? Ihi, wihi, wana. We've got all these different kupu that are actually about invigorating. And what she's saying is that some is invigorating internally and some is invigorating externally. So the external impact on you is significant. And we do that. And that you can see, so, kei roto I tōna tinana, te ihihei, engari ka puta mai ki waho ko te wana tērā. Ka kiti atu ko te wana kei ronga I tana kanohi. So we asked Pania, so this is from Pania Papa, again around iaha tēnei mea ngā Kare-ā-roto. And her kōrero is in many ways going to link to what Rangi is going to kōrero around, but her kōrero is around the wai, ko te wai ki roto I a koe. And ko te karekare o te wai I roto I te tangata. He nui te wai ki roto I te tangata. I mean, we're what, 90%? Wai? How clever our tupuna are, eh? Ko wai koe. How clever are we to utilise their whole framing? So when people tell us we don't do science, of Of course we do science. Our tupuna knew the component of wai, of what flows through us as tangata. I tēnā wā o te tau I puta mai ana te marama a rona whakamautai e kukumea nei ngā wai o te moana e rua I te whenua e nui ai ngā tai puta noa I te motu ka kite te mana o te marama ki te tū mai I ngā wai I roto I te tangata. So she was drawing, which many people draw, that relationship of wai in terms of rona, in terms of marama, in terms of hina, that we're still revitalising through those that are leaving out maramataka. What is that relationship? Is there a relationship? Is there a relationship from rona, marama, ngā tai, hene moana, tangaroa, tangata? What is the relationship? And how does that work itself out? How does that play itself out? Or what is the consciousness we may need to have? So I think that we, and again, Rangi has talked about this before, we tend to see it as individual. And we know that we have individual emotions. We are not saying we don't have individual feelings, but maramataka, hapu iwi are collective entities. So how do they play themselves out in that collective way? That's a question. And this one from Matua Tōmaroa, and, he's talking about mauri and emotion. So there's so many components to emotions, Māori nei. So when we think about mauri, we think about either tangata. If we think about either tangata, if we go back to the Native American framework around how historical trauma is passed intergenerationally, how does that happen? Through mauri and either tangata. In a similar frame. Many years ago, Robert Pōwhare did a documentary that I was really privileged to work alongside him, with him doing it, around genetic engineering. And the impact of genetic engineering on fire. It's just lovely to have you here in your whānau space around the mahi you've been doing here in Tauranga. We had a quick talk before about how the whānau here around the stomach cancer were instrumental in really informing a lot of Māori whānau around the motu that we can take control of our own healing, that we can determine which parts we're involved in and which parts we're not involved in, and that we can do that and have control. And it was, that was years ago, and it still continues to impact on how whānau around the motu who are finding themselves with these genetic experiences in their whakapapa now, can think about how they can see healing and how they can be self-determining in that space. So, nā mihi atu kia koe me tō whānau. And in that, one of the kuia from the kura in Manerua, Whai Hoana, she said, kei roto I te ira tangata, kei roto I te ira, he wānanga ki tō ira. Okay, he wānanga ki tō ira. So it says a wānanga in every ira. Then if you change the wānanga in one ira, you are changing the wānanga in relation to all the other ira. And I just remember that, for me, that just was very insightful and really made me think a lot about, so within ira tangata, because in Western science, they reduce it to a chemical substance of DNA, right? But in Te Ao Māori, we know it's more than that. Because wānanga is more than the chemical expression of something. So if within those ira, we have wānanga in the many millions and millions of ira that we each have, what does it say when trauma interrupts that wānanga and the relationships of those wānanga? And that's why we've kept looking back to Native American ways of thinking about it, Indigenous ways of thinking about it, because that supports all of that work. But we also need to remember that we don't only carry the trauma in our ira. We also carry the maumahara, the memory in our ira. We also carry the mātauranga in our ira. We also carry the joy in our ira. And so we can't only lean to the trauma part. And this mahi is telling us the same thing. That all of these are in relationship to each other. And so when I heard Matua Tom talk about, the relationship in terms of mauri, again, that takes us to the whakaaro around tuakiri. And so it just gets bigger and bigger. You can see how this is just a teeny bit that we're thinking about. And then at the end of this particular quote, he's talking about that relationship of he kare-ā-roto, he aronui, he wehi, he tapu, similarly he mātou. But at the end he talks about the ideas of physical senses from his karaua. Remember that in our Māori world we only have two physical senses. You either see something or you feel it. Te kite me te rongo. Nor they the emotions of what you feel, ngā rongo. I mean, that's a really interesting thing for us to rethink, because again, in many of our trainings, we're trained with 5 senses in a Western frame, and often they throw in a 6th one because they forget that wairua happens. So, so in that. But what happens when you collapse 4 of those into one, into rongo? What happens with how we sense things? How do we come to understand things? These are all just questions. These are not answers. And others may have different views on this. But it's just something for us to, I guess the role of research in many ways is to help us to question and be curious about other things and to reveal some things that have been sitting there for many years that our tupuna did, but we, for many reasons, and particularly around the colonisation of our knowledge, which we now refer to as, that kind of knowledge violence or symbolic violence or epistemic violence, knowledge, the way in which one knowledge is put over and above another knowledge base, is that we're starting to just really go back. And te reo, people are saying very clearly that actually it's a nao reo. So the revitalisation of te reo Māori has never only been about te reo Māori. It's always been about te reo tikanga mātauranga. Mātauranga a hapu, mātauranga a whānau, mātauranga a iwi, mātauranga a Māori. It's always been those multiple layers of Māori. And so the colonisation of te reo Māori has been about the colonisation of every aspect of ourselves, not just about the denial of te reo Māori. And we see a full circle now, coming back now with this government, coming back now with the marginalisation and the denial of resourcing to te reo Māori. And I remember up in Waitangi last year or this year probably, no, last year, Hone Harawira saying very directly to the Crown in his very direct manner, if you think you can stop te reo Māori, I'm telling you can't, because that horse done bolted. Te reo Māori is no longer in their domain. No matter what they do, that's now in our domain. It's in our domain. And so we need to find other ways, and I think it's coming through hapuru, through hapu and iwi, other ways that we uplift te reo Māori for ourselves. That does not mean we forget that they are structurally being violent toward us, because we can't forget that. People still have to work on that stuff. But what this is saying is that within our reo, we know that there is all of the knowledge embedded in it. We just have to revitalise it and bring that back forward. And then people have been talking about different kupu that come up for them, and we're going to do a little bit in the workshop this afternoon around how they think about it. Now, not all these kupu are the same for everyone. We don't use them all in the same way, but they're talking about different forms of mamai, pēhitanga, how that comes about, the way in which and again, this person, when they were sharing this, and the other one they talked about the kind of spiritual intelligence and the security alarm. This one, again, is their emotional alert system, alerting us to something. And so they're drawing on the kupu from their kuia. And actually quite a lot of people are drawing on kupu or experiences from kuia okarawa that they remember. So when we think about Whaekar's discussion around tairongo, we've been asking people, do you have any other kupu for Kare-ā-roto? What are other kupu that you use? And interestingly, people are coming up with various rongo terms. So in Taranaki, Kiri-o-pai was very clear. In Taranaki, the term we used was aurongo. Aurongo. So those currents. Similar, and even tairongo with census is all related to wai. Yeah? But then others said, we didn't actually have a kupu. We go, tērā āhua tērā. Tērā āhuatanga o tērā tangata. Or some would say that's the momo of their whānau. He riri tērā whānau, tērā tētahi momo. So, they would describe it in other ways that were more aligned to characteristics, what we'd say characteristics or traits of people. And so they'd say certain people had a certain āhuatanga. Or they were exhibiting one mātanga there on Taranaki said that her kuia would just talk about the different āhuatanga of the different people as they moved around the spaces, and would say to them, kia tūpato tēnei te āhuatanga o tērā, in a hui. Now, I don't know if you've been in hui, but, I'm sorry, I know you've been in hui. I mean, in those hui where people have actually beforehand said to you, someone's come in with a particular āhua and they can tell. It's not generally that way that person is, but they've either come in pauri, or they've come in riri, or they've come in a particular way, and so to be careful with that particular person in the hui. So we did a session in Taranaki last month, and we were having it's a research training, and I was sitting next to Kiterangi Ngaropi's daughter, and someone made a comment and we both went, oh, that's the one. That's the one in this group of 40 people that we're going to be living with for the next 5 months doing this mahi that we need to engage differently with. Okay? It's not that was a negative thing, but it was just very clear in the āhua. And actually it worked. We did engage differently with that person in the hui. And in the second 2-day hui, when he walked in the room, his āhua was much more uplifted and he was in a different space. So those understandings of reading the room, I think we do quite a lot. In hui, we just may not recognise that we are actually picking up on someone's emotional space or where someone is at in the particular time. And I think we underplay that knowledge that somehow we've been able to maintain. Other people have talked about in terms of emotional state, whether you call it intelligence, a regulation in the Pākehā terms, how we... Because in many ways, the way that we interact with each other, our Māori, is really about recognising that actually we need to regulate ourselves as well as how we interact with other people. And so they talk about what is tika. Ia kia taku tikanga kia tai atu ki te taumata mo te tika. So tika, pono, all those things often come in around making and a spiritually intelligent, this is from the person from the first quote, a spiritually intelligent decision. A spiritually intelligent decision. They're not saying making an emotionally intelligent decision. They're actually taking it to another place around what is tika and pono for them. And that being emotionally intelligent is a part of our responsibility we have to ourselves, but I also think it's a part of our collective responsibility that we have. And I'm just aware of the time, I want to come down to, because there are a whole range of expressions in which people talk about pono, tika, tikanga, tikanga enabling us to think about emotions in ways that are aligned to how we want to be in the world. But I want to come to this one around collective expression, and this is from the Whāroto newspaper or magazine in 1907. And this is something that Hene Moana shared with us. Now, when we read through this, ka pāna te pauri ki te Māori, ka tangi, ka heke te roimata, ka heke te hupu, nā konei hoki e whakatauki te ai, ka heke te roimata me te hupe ka ea te mati. Mā te heke o te roimata, mā te ngunguru o te waha, ka māriri te pauri. Tēnā ko te Pākehā, ka kutia ia te ngākau pauri, te ngākau aroha ki roto i te manua hotu ai. I te pēhi o te Pākehā i tōna ngākau pauri, ka kia e te Māori ka rihe aroha o te Pākehā. Ko tō te Māori hia hoki, kia ki te tonu o ngā kanohi, kia whāwhā tonu o ngā ringaringa, kia rongo tōna o ngā taringa, nā rongo i tēnei āwhatanga o te Māori, ara i tōna whai, kia ki te rawa o ngā kanohi, ka whakapono ai ia. So, from very early on, our tupuna recognised the different ways in which Pākehā expressed grief or didn't express grief. They recognised that we had a significant way in which we expressed grief through tangi in order to release that from ourselves and collectively, and that in many ways Pākehā were about repressing sadness. And that means you don't show your aroha in this view for that person. So this is a general translation that Hene did around that particular kōrero, but that through the shedding of tears and reverberating vocal expression, sadness is alleviated. Pākehā, on the other hand, suppress their emotions and any outward expression of grief and love. The repression of sadness by Pākehā has led Māori to explain that Pākehā have no aroha. It's a lovely translation too, you know. So that's 1907. That's in 1907. Our tupuna is saying the way they grieve and the way we grieve, tēnō rereke. Tēnō rereke e tērā āwhatanga. That we have collective expression, processes of grief, of tangi, but I think we have it of all emotions actually. And you can tell when a Māori tells a joke and all the Māoris laugh and no one else laughs. Hey. Both in Te Reo Māori and in English. I've seen that happen in English. Māori tell a joke in English too and all the Māoris laugh and everyone else is going, what are they laughing at? It's not. You know, that we have collective expressions that we get. And this one, I just picked a couple that from the different whakawhiti kōrero that whānau shared around that in particular, around tangi in particular. Tangi seems to be the go-to that many of our people want to talk about when we talk about emotions, which is really interesting that we go straight to grief as our examples and tangi. But it also may be a reflection of we've held much more of that mātauranga and practice because we continue to have tangi ana. Even with all of the things that are still happening, even with all the marginalisation, even with the disconnection, there's still a degree to which we've probably held quite a lot of that. But that there are some things that are changing and shifting. And so she said, I always remember asking my kuia, why do you tangi so much? Because sometimes you go on for ages. This is what they reflected on when they were children, talking to their kuia. And she said, I'm giving the ope that's coming with me or coming on permission to let their emotions go. That is my role, she said. So yes, it's my grief. I think I said something to her like, oh, you must get tired of the tangi to hold that. And she said, yeah, it's exhausting. But it's also my role to give others permission to let their emotions free. E ki te roe mata me te hupe ka ea te mate. And when people started talking about that in particular, I started remembering more of my own experiences and more around how little in Taranaki we see this now. We see much less of the deep grieving, wailing that we used to do when we were children. Things really have changed. I remember when I was a child, we never turned the lights off in the wharenui on the last night. You never turned the lights off. Anyone could get up at any time. People would, I'd be thinking, oh, that woke me up at 2 o'clock in the morning, someone would jump up. But the lights were on all night. We tend to turn the lights off at 9 o'clock now, they have a sleep. I mean, they seem like small changes, but they're actually quite big changes. And then there was a number of people have talked about tangi in particular. E au I tamariki ana ai rawa, kei te maumahara rawa atu ahau I tērā āhuatanga e a mātou hoki atu ki te kāinga mō ngā tangihanga. Ko ngā kuia I aua ai auwe. E tamariki a hau, engari I te nuinga o te wā, kāre au te mōhio I te tūpāpaku, e takoto mai nei hoi e tangi hotu a hau, ko tērā tā rātou mahi, kia tangi hotu te katoa. So that memory of the role of certain people to enable the grief to be fully released. To be fully released and to not be held in with tidy tissues, because that's what we've been told for many years, is that in a colonial context, that kind of staunch upper lip stuff that came with colonisation, that's impacted on all of us. It's impacted very severely, in my view, on our men and the role of our men in tangi, and not just in tangi, but in terms of how our boys and men are allowed to be. And therefore that impacts on all of us, but also on our roles and the roles of people to enable release, because unresolved grief, everything tells us in the Indigenous world, comes back to haunt us and re-traumatise others often in that context. So koe rā etahi o ngā whakaaro I putu mai from some of the kōrero that we've had, and I'm going to leave it there and ask Naomi to come up and share her whakaaro around whenua and Kare-ā-roto in particular and the place of whenua. But are there any pātai around that? As I was saying at the beginning, this is just starting to share some of the whakaaro of our people around this kaupapa. Are there any pātai or whakaaro? Are they familiar? Yeah. I mean, we're talking to 60 people around the motu, around their whakaaro, and similar things keep coming up. Similar things keep coming up about how do we utilise our own tikanga e mātauranga to heal ourselves and on all levels, spiritually, emotionally. So, it's all learnings for us, but some of it we are very familiar with, and other things are really starting to make us think, oh shit, we haven't heard that one before, or hadn't thought about that. And the rongo and kite one is quite big, and Tākiri Rangi Smith writes about it. On Te Atu Whai o Te Ao, the Wanganui Institute, they did a lot of work on historical trauma, and there's a report on there, I think it's Te Ara Ora, something, I'll find the name. And in there, they got Tākiri Rangi to write a lot about rongo and kite, and the role too of rongo in terms of atua, and rongo a in terms of healing. And so if you want to have a look at that, that's all online. Kia ora.